Hi, my name is Stephen Nolan and I'm the Managing Director of the UN-convened Financial Centres for Sustainability. I'm also honoured to be the Chairman of this year's Climate Finance Week. Today is the second day of the programme and it's focused on ESG. Specifically, today is Ireland's 4th ESG Day and it's proudly sponsored by Irish Life Investment Managers and Skillnet Ireland. I'm about to hand over to my colleague, Emma Jane Joyce, who is moderating the session in an ESG world is a corporate governance framework fit for purpose. Emma Jane, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our panel. In an ESG world is corporate governance framework fit for purpose. I'm Emma Jane Joyce. I'm an investment director with the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel of experts as we navigate this space. Obviously, this is Climate Finance Week, and we're all very focused on climate and the environment and, the E of ESG. But this afternoon, we'd like to redirect your focus towards the G of ESG, of governance structures, and how perhaps they may help and even maybe sometimes hinder ESG integration. So we have an esteemed panel of experts to guide you through what can sometimes feel like something of an overwhelming topic. So I'll start by introducing them. First up, we have Peter Stapleton. Peter is head of Maple's Group Funds and Investment Management Team. Peter holds several senior positions on different industry groups, advising both public and private sectors on enhancing Ireland's financial services regime. He's a recognised legal expert in the area of ESG and sustainable investment, and works with some of the fund's largest managers and financial institutions to help them implement their commitments under various frameworks such as the PRI and also the EU Sustainable Action Plan. Peter will be followed by Dr. Margaret Cullen, founder and principal of Think Governance. Dr. Cullen is a specialist in the area of corporate and investment fund governance. Her doctoral research explored the role and effectiveness of boards of directors in investment fund governance, and she has a particular interest in board effectiveness, dynamics, decision-making, corporate culture, stewardship, and corporate social responsibility. And followed by Margaret is Jamie Gorenstein, who is a senior engager at EOS at Federated Hermes, formerly Hermes EOS. He specialises in a number of different industrial sectors, including financial services, mining and materials, and oil and gas. And he is responsible for leading corporate governance engagements or corporate engagements on behalf of a range of different EOS clients with particular focus in Latin America and Russia. Prior to joining EOS, Jamie worked for the Brazilian Development Bank. So he really is an expert on a variety of different international corporate governance flavors and is bringing, a global lens to our discussion this afternoon as well. So I'm going to start by, passing you over to Peter. So what Peter is going to try to do today as we, navigate through this corporate governance world, he's going to start by guiding you through the macro regulatory environment, and then we'll move on from Peter to Margaret and Margaret and Jamie to get more into the micro detail. So handing over to Peter, thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma Jane. Thanks very much for the warm welcome and also to everybody joining us today as a participant. As Emma Jane mentioned, I head up the Funds and Investment Management Group at Maples. We have over 2,500 people, lawyers, professional staff and experts who've been working for several decades in the area of principal responsible investment and ESG. What we're going to show now on the presentation, you can hopefully see on your screen, is shortly to take you through a couple of the key issues which are going to come up and trends in corporate governance. So where we start off on our journey, and where many of you who are dialing in today and participating all over the globe might be aware of, is that historically there was only a general corporate governance framework overseeing areas of principles of responsible investment and ESG. That might have been in domestic companies acts, financial services legislation, or specific industry bodies, and indeed the work in Ireland of people like Stephen Nolan and others for decades in industry bodies trying to raise awareness of this. However, they were tangential legal or regulatory requirements. What we did see as the climate emergency shifted up the agenda was a leadership movement towards principles at a high level, and probably the most notable example of that was the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. And again, looking at it through the corporate governance lens, Maples would have advised a number of our clients on principles 2 and 3, 2 being the ownership policies and procedures, and 3 on the disclosures of investee companies. And as we know, the UN PRI, and as we've heard this week, has been phenomenally successful and a real driving force in this area. But when the scale of the climate emergency truly came into stark contrast, I think the EU, to its credit, decided to take a global leadership role in this and move from voluntary principles or signatories towards binding regulations, which emanated from a sustainable action plan, which was issued in March of 2018. And that sustainable action plan is vast in scale, both in its application to member states, financial market participants, so banks, insurance companies, asset managers, the products they issue, bonds, funds, equities, etc., and then also to corporates. So we're going to examine a little bit of that and the shift towards that dynamic. And then finally, we'll finish up on global alignment. So I mentioned the EU's taken a leadership role, but we're seeing the SEC, the FCA, the SFC, and others also follow. So if I move into the first topic and we take a spotlight on SFDR, or the Sustainable Financial Disclosures Regulation, it focuses on, at a core element of it, governance. So it classifies a sustainable investment, a bedrock of the entire plan, as meaning an investment into an economic activity which contributes to an environmental objective. So as we've heard as well previously, as measured by, for example, the use of renewable energy or impact on biodiversity, has a social objective. It might be labour relations. But there are some caveats in those two elements. And the first one is provided those investments do not significantly harm any of the other objectives. And principally, and in this area, what we'll discuss today, that the investee companies follow good governance practices, in particular with regard to sound management, structures, employee relations, remuneration of staff, and tax compliance. So there we see the corporate governance moving from voluntary principles into hard-coded legislation. And the SFDR is not alone. It's part of a long and wide package of other governance requirements in the action plan. So again, most of the participants will be now familiar with the EU taxonomy, which creates a unified corporate framework or harmonized definition of what is a sustainable investment, and the key initially environmental metrics which it is aimed at. The taxonomy is interlinked with SFDR, so those corporate governance principles that I mentioned are imported into it and coexist in both regulations. But interestingly, the taxonomy goes further and stems into the alignment of what financial market participants are doing and the alignment of their investments with the taxonomy itself. So one of the first aspects we're seeing of that is the non-corporate financial disclosures regime, where the very largest companies in Europe and indeed beyond, because an important element of the action plan is that while it principally applies to EU entities, if you are a US or Asian-based global manager that has a subsidiary or affiliate here, you'll be called or market products into the EU. But the corporate financial disclosures metric is now looking at alignment with the taxonomy and in particular focus on Article 8. If we then move into even more specific areas of corporate governance, we have the sustainable corporate governance and attenuating short-termism. This was a key part of the action plan, and the Commission specifically asked the regulators of European banking, insurance and asset management to look at where short-term investing was actually creating harmful effects and damaging the goal of sustainability. And they produced a couple of reports which are interesting for all participants in that area, but in particular it's now led to an idea whereby we would take corporate governance and a specific number of themes and progress those. And they're on things like directors' duties, remuneration, enforcement of directors' duties, and even as far as going to showing expertise on the board as to sustainable and principles of responsible investment. We have the Central Bank of Ireland, and we know the Governor spoke very eloquently today and outlined the vision of the bank, and that probably has two twin tenets that I'll bring up at the moment. One, he alluded to the fact that he would soon be writing to regulators and other regulated entities in Ireland, looking to convene a cross-sectoral forum to discuss sustainability risks and how Ireland would take a leadership role on a regulatory side for that. And secondly, it built on the work of the third annual Climate Finance Week last year, where Jerry Cross from the bank noted the climate change unit which had been developed. And this also builds on other areas of financial services. So we've moved now from some of the more corporate high-level principles into many people listening into this call today will be in the regulated space. And we had 7 delegated acts, which again are now integrating sustainability issues and considerations into the following EU legislative regimes. And they're the bedrocks of asset management and insurance. They came into force just very recently this August, and they have an implementation date running into 2022. And at a high level, for UCITS and AIFMD, it's going to look at things like conflicts of interest, integrating sustainability risks and management practices. In MiFID II, it's going to look at the distribution network and taking client suitability preferences into account when distributing products, or even looking at the product governance and approval process. And then finally on Solvency II and in the insurance distribution side, it's also going to look at things like conflicts of interest and sustainability risks. So we can see the complete shift into now quite a bespoke and targeted corporate governance regime. But there are for boards, and one of the constant themes that we hear, I'm sure we'll discuss this afternoon, is what are the practical solutions? People are very easy to point to a wide body of legislation, and yes, it is complex. Yes, in some cases it's delayed. But what you can do now is to move and to address the climate emergency. Your own organisation can take practical solutions to get on top of it. And we typically see this taking the form of board meeting agendas and action points, identifying the universe of top-down and bottom-up requirements, and that's across the entire sphere of expertise that you would see on the right-hand side, where our teams at Maples are advising in these areas. And you can come up with something like a reporting matrix. We've taken one in the bottom left and simplified this and shown how you can address issues like corporate governance, the taxonomy, gender pay gap, or even modern slavery. And what we do is analyse that across your entire business. So you could, for example, look at a UK company post-Brexit and the gap, or back into Ireland. And finally, I'll finish up before I hand back to Emma Jane and the panel with some future thought leadership examples. Where will boards get the expertise to deal with these challenges? Well, as we saw, a cornerstone of today was the launch of Ireland's Sustainable Finance Roadmap. I think the Institute potentially has the ability to become a leader in corporate governance solutions. You also have some of these specific action points and pillars. So I think we see one on best-in-class legal and regulatory roadmap. We have the Do No Significant Harm Handbook, which we're going to publish together with a member of the European Technical Expert Group and the Frankfurt School of Economics. Look out for that. That's quite an exciting development and a key area. Organisations like AMA will publish global guides for fund directors with some of the Maples teams, and that will go and explain how ESG is factored into it. We had Patrick and the SkillNet team taking a leadership role, Irish funds, and very finally you can see additional resources on some of these topics on our groups. So to summarise, before I hand back to Emma Jane and the panel, there is quite a large body of law and regulation coming down here, but there are significant resources in the market, but also practical ways of dealing with it. Back over to you, Emma Jane.
Thank you, Peter. As always, you've provided a calm and clear oversight of how the regulatory framework has changing, has moved from voluntary to regulatory, and also provided some practical solutions for boards to be considering. So in keeping with that theme, as we move from regulation through to practical considerations, I'm going to introduce Margaret Cullen. And Margaret is going to really discuss the relationship between corporate governance structures and the role of the board, and how the board needs clarity on their purpose and strategy as they drive ESG. So over to you, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Emma Jane, and delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation, SFI. Brilliant event so far this week. I'm hoping that my clicker will go. Okay, my clicker isn't working, so I'm going to have to ask Stephen to move me along, if that's okay, Stephen. Thank you. It's never all right in the night. Well, look, I mean, one of the things that I want to do is bring us back somewhat to talk about corporate governance and to remind ourselves what corporate governance is. One of the challenges, particularly when we, within the ESG acronym, is that in my own view, the G is put third, and I always like to elevate G up to the very top. The danger and the risk is that we look at G in the context of maybe governance form as distinct from the system of direction and control that it actually is. So my first point, I guess, when we're standing back and looking, is the corporate governance framework fit for purpose, is to encourage everyone to stand back a little bit and say that the governance is the most important aspect. It's the key part. we direct and control, and we do that by first having a clear understanding of our purpose, which I'll come back to later. Understanding within, as a board of directors, what we are put on this planet to do as a board of directors, and what is the purpose of the company. Because only when we get that understanding are we able to determine our key strategic objectives, the risk appetite within which we will operate, the control environment which we will operate, and the kind of culture we want to espouse. And only understand how we integrate and have a good understanding of our environmental impact and our societal impact, and how we can, given the objectives of the EU Action Plan, how we can direct our governance, direct our company, incorporating and integrating initiatives to improve our environmental and social impact. I think that's really, really important. I think that G isn't just about the form, G is the direction and control, which helps and supports the environmental and the societal aspect. In terms of, the question, is the corporate governance framework fit for purpose? Well, Peter set me up really well, because, he talked in the very beginning about the general corporate governance framework. And when we think of corporate governance frameworks, such as, for example, the UK Corporate Governance Code, which is adopted on both sides of the Irish Sea, in the UK and Ireland, but also is the code that tends to influence so much of the corporate governance agenda and other corporate governance codes globally. I would argue that the corporate governance code is very much fit for purpose, because what it gives us is good principles, principles that should influence the system of corporate governance. And I think that when you add that to all of the regulatory initiatives that have followed, I think that there has some brilliant work been done. The UK Corporate Governance Code has spoken about ESG for a number of years, probably since the 2018 revision. So I think that the macro level, we're in a good place. And the question is, for those who seek to comply with the code or apply the code, either because they are listed or because they are large private entities and think they should, or indeed small businesses who just want to adopt best practice. I suppose there's a question mark about whether the governance, the micro at the level of the firm, whether they have the structures in place, and whether they have the mindset in place to deal with some of the issues that have come out of consideration of ESG. So thanks, Stephen. If you can move on there, thank you. So there are a number of players on the pitch, and I think it's worth kind of just trying to join a few of those dots and stand back a little bit. I mean, this week is all about Climate Finance Week, and all about, I guess, delivering on the EU action plan to finance sustainability. But let's look. I mean, on the right hand side, I've mentioned the Paris Accord, which is, I suppose, is the global initiative. Then you've got regional initiatives such as the EU Action Plan. We have a number of agencies, such as we've mentioned the UNPRI and other NGOs and professional bodies that are, seeking to influence the agenda. But let's focus a little bit on the left-hand side, and I try to kind of join up a little bit of the ecosystem here. I haven't included the consumer, which I think has a significant role in an economic or an economy-wide assessment of governance. But just if we focus on the three that I have to the left, particularly relevant in the context of the discussion of G, because G is relevant to all of them. So let me start at the bottom in terms of the companies. So all companies are going to have to adopt. Okay, some of them will have to adopt because they will be directly impacted by EU legislation. Some of them will have to adopt because they want to, and because the boards are creating that impetus. Some will be responding to investors, investor engagement, and investors' expectation in relation to what they see is appropriate for companies. Some companies will have that direct impact from investors because they're listed. Others, by osmosis, as best practice emerges, and we'll have to seek guidance, whether it's through, there are a variety of mechanisms they can seek guidance, and of course, industry bodies have a key role here. But the providers of finance also, and we've heard significantly from the great work that AIB have been doing in the area of sustainability and the provision of sustainable finance. And they too have to get their governance ducks in a row, the same way as the investors do. And they have to understand their purpose and how the objectives of the EU Action Plan fit in to their purpose, their raison d'etre, and how they function as an organisation. And then, in terms of the companies, and in terms of all this ecosystem, we all have to work together. So I heard yesterday someone describe the tsunami of regulatory changes that have come the way of all of these component parts: investors, providers of finance like banks and companies, and there's more to come. And there is somewhat of a disparity and fragmentation of ESG reporting frameworks, and we need to move to get that right. And I think that we're moving in the right direction, and and that's important that we do. I think that there is some slight differences between regional regulatory approaches, and again, Peter has alluded to the fact that the EU is going out of the blocks very quickly. We're seeing movements in the UK and the US, and hopefully we'll see more of an alignment. We know that there's a lot of varying and complex data requirements needed to meet all of the demands. Investors are struggling with the data they need, companies are struggling with the data they need to provide, and banks are struggling with both aspects as well. But one of the things that I think is important in all aspects of governance, and I include integration of notions of issues of sustainability and issues of environmental and social aspects, is the consistency of language. And I think that we still have a little bit of a way to go. The most important thing that I would say to every board director on this call is create a consistent language within your boardroom and within your organisation, whether you're sitting at the investor level, the bank level, other providers of finance, or at the company level. Create a language around the areas of environmental and social aspects, and socialise that into your governance dialogue. Okay. Thanks, Stephen. Next slide, please. So just keeping with that, keeping with these three players, I've mentioned purpose, purpose, purpose. One of my concerns always when I talk to companies in class, mostly directors who are grappling with how they respond to everything that's, I suppose, all of the changes and all of the impetus in relation to looking at the environment and social aspects of their business. As I say, well, what you don't want to do is respond to a blueprint and back your corporate truck or back your bank into what you perceive to be a blueprint. I think it's really important that for boards, the most important thing they do is define that purpose, and as I said, create a language. Starting with the investors at the top there, investors need to be very clear. They need to be very clear on the, on their expectations of investee companies. Those investee companies might be banks. Those investee companies might be non-financial services institutions or organisations. Excuse me. It's important that there's a clarity around that expectation, and that links back to the kind of purpose and related strategy of investors, investor organisations, asset owners, asset managers. But they have a very clear idea of what they're trying to achieve, and that dialogue is very consistent when engaging with companies. Okay, I think it's really important for investors to give investee companies time. I'll say in my next slide, just to preempt it, it's a marathon, not a sprint for companies. They need the finance to be able to improve their environmental and social footprint, but it's important that investors and indeed banks give them time to do that. So I think that that's a really important aspect for investors. Moving then to the providers of finance and banks again is, and I'm sure the board of AIB, who we've heard a lot from Colin Hunt and his team over the last couple of days. I'm sure the board stood back and considered deeply so many aspects related to this agenda. I mean, you're thinking about, if you're a provider of finance, you're thinking about your own environmental footprint. Okay, so how much data I use, how much paper I use, how many cars we drive in and out of work. And then you're moving into also, mainstreaming sustainability risk into the management of your loan book and the impact that actually environmental risks can have on collateral to banks and so on and so forth. But then also it's how banks support the EU Action Plan and sustainable finance through products, through their pricing, risk management and customer engagement, and indeed, particularly from the social aspect, integrating all of that into the provision of product and making finance accessible. So again, that's a huge part of the corporate governance agenda. The board needs to have its arm around all of this, the strategic risk appetite, and the cultural perspective, all part of the governance. And then moving lastly then to the companies, the listed private companies, listed companies, large private SMEs. And when we think of SMEs being the bedrock, being the cornerstone of any economy, and again, they mightn't have that direct engagement with investors, and so therefore the providers of finance have a very important role in supporting companies, large private SMEs, and indeed listed as appropriate, in navigating this and understanding, being very clear on the expectation. So for companies, regardless of context, again, that language, creation, that language I've mentioned earlier, understanding your environmental and social footprint. Some of things will be direct, some will be indirect. Direct could be because of the work you undertake, might have a direct impact on the environment. Others, it might have an indirect impact on the environment, or an indirect social impact, for example, through your supply chain and so on. You need to understand the relationship between your business activities and the sustainability of your business, but also the sustainability of society, and the impact that you have. Okay, understand investor expectations, and understand, engage with your banks, and understand what is available to you, and what are the conditions of receipt of sustainable finance. Okay, thanks, Stephen. Stephen, can I have the next slide? Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So just to get back to that notion of purpose, and I think this is often can seem a little bit nebulous, but really, what we don't want as a board, in any one of those dimensions, from investor to bank to corporate, what we don't want is to be backing our governance truck into some preordained blueprint. We need to understand, what are the expectations? What are we clear about our purpose? Feeding that into our strategic objectives, but considering that in the context of regulatory expectations. So if you take it from an investor point of view, the investors are going to try to navigate within a taxonomy, and that will feed very much into their expectations of companies, of course, and the data required. So for companies, you need to assess where are their gaps, where are their contradictions. Critically, this is all about industry collaboration. We need to work together to speak a common language, to work out the data we need, and the areas that we need to focus. And the key thing is, for all of us, what are the opportunities here? And some of them will be commercial, but also opportunities to really contribute to this really important work and to the creation of a sustainable society. Thanks, Stephen. Down to the last slide now. Thank you. So look, just to pull it in a little bit, unlike my speed, which I've gone through the slides, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And what I would advise all companies at all of those different layers, be it an investor layer, provider finance layer, bank layer, whether it is company layer, engage with the European Commission consultations. So whether it is lack of clarity, challenge, seek that clarity, try to understand what the expectations are, what the objectives are, and how you fit into that. Within industry, collaboration is so pivotal. Within banks, within the asset management world, and companies themselves engaging with each other, particularly within sector, that you understand, again, understanding your environmental and social footprint and how it links into your business operation. Okay, I've mentioned the importance of clarity and realism. There has to be a realistic time frame given to companies to adapt. And the provision of finance and sustainable finance is one thing, but there has to be a capacity to adapt. The economy-wide view, we have to take a much broader view. I mentioned the consumer early on, the consumer and how they respond to the actions of companies who are making efforts in this world is really, really critical. But again, I'll go back. The role of the investor community, they're almost top of that pyramid there, and not this pyramid, the early one in terms of the relationships, have a really important role in setting the expectations. So I'm going to hand over to Jamie now, or via Emma Jane, to pick up the story. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. As always, I had the pleasure of having Margaret as a lecturer relatively recently, and we had many debate on these types of issues and the importance of boards in terms of having clear, consistent language, clarity of purpose, understanding their strategy, and I think something that maybe we can nearly all be guilty of is trying to fit our own strategies into other frameworks, but actually having that clarity up front about both the risks that sustainability poses to our businesses, but also what we're really focused on, I think, this week is the opportunity to deliver impact. So thank you for that. So I'd like to take the opportunity now to introduce our third speaker, so Jamie Gornstein. And Jamie's going to, I suppose, keep with this theme of moving from macro to micro, and even more so now into the role of the investor, which Margaret has set up nicely for us, and to talk through the practical ways in which investors can use corporate governance structures, to engage with corporates, to influence change, and ultimately, I suppose, drive a wide range of ESG issues, which ultimately, from an investor perspective, these are important because we want to make better investment decisions and ultimately contribute to the long-term sustainability of both our portfolios and obviously the companies in which we are invested. So I'm going to pass over to Jamie now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma Jane. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and sharing some thoughts with you about the role of investors in the corporate governance framework of the investee companies, and particularly trying to answer the question: is corporate governance framework fit for purpose in an ESG world? As Emma Jane said in the introduction, I work for EOS at Federated Hermes, and I responsible for engaging with portfolio companies in a number of different markets, different sectors, particularly on ESG issues that affect the company's long-term wealth creation. And we seek to establish a very active dialogue with our portfolio companies at board level, at senior management level, with a view of not just collecting information, but crucially to influencing the companies we invest in for them to improve, to try and promote positive change in the companies where we invest. And corporate governance, and I concur with Peter and Margaret, that corporate governance is the foundation for long-term sustainable development. It's of course, nowadays you often see investors very vocal about climate change, about human rights, and of course that's crucial for the companies. But engagement on corporate governance and ensuring that there is a framework that's fit for purpose, is the foundation that on top of which we build good environmental practices or good social practices. So that's I would argue that's an obligation, a duty of investors to engage on corporate governance with their portfolio companies. So moving to the next slide, Stephen, if you could help me. So it just the main points that I wanted to touch with you. And the first is how investors then, how they use their influence to promote best practices in the companies. I think there are two pillars. One is responsible investment, and the second is active ownership. So by responsible investment, I mean integrating in our investment decisions ESG factors. So governance, social, environmental aspects, fully integrate them into investment decisions, investment, divestment, increasing exposure, and that applies to equity, debt, and also to private markets as well. So making sure that ESG is not an afterthought. It's not something that we are going to assess ex post once the decision is made, but rather it's a part of the decision-making process, of the investment process. And the second pillar, and I touch on it briefly, it's active ownership, it's engagement, it's not just investing and waiting for the best, but actually establishing a dialogue or collaborating with the companies, pressing for change, or using the voting power to also as a way to promote the change in the company. So those are the two pillars that investors can use and must use in promoting positive change in the company, in the investee companies. And particularly in terms of governance, as I said, we understand it as the foundation for long-term wealth creation. And building on Peter's presentation about how we are moving towards a more prescriptive, rules-based approach to governance in many markets, and companies, they respond to that. Of course, they have to respond to that, but it's and I've seen in many markets, often the result can be a kind of box ticking approach, where companies say, well, we tick all the boxes, we comply with all the regulations. But my question is that enough to ensure a corporate governance framework that's fit for purpose? And I would say that it's not enough. It's not enough. It needs to be done. Company that needs to comply with the regulations, or company needs to implement the recommendations of local corporate governance code, but that's not enough, because it's the matter of substance over form. So are companies generally embracing good practice in corporate governance, or are they just ticking the boxes? And that comes this very close dialogue that we establish with boards and management, where we are constantly probing what's the company's approach to corporate governance? Is it box ticking, or is generally embracing the substance of best practice in the company? And I'm going to touch on some examples of that. And so what are our priorities, and what in my work, in my day-to-day engagement with companies, what are the topics that I mostly discuss with them, and where do you see progress, where we don't see progress? And I would say, and also Margaret touched on the role of the board, and we agreed, I mean, a strong board, diverse, fit for purpose, effective board, that's essential. And we spend a lot of time engaging on that. But it's, and I think our engagement, whereas in the recent past, was focused on level of independence, number of women on the board, number of seats, how the committees are organized, the skills. Now we go much deeper and really seek to engage not just on the composition, what I call the hardware of the board, but crucially on its effectiveness. So, for example, if the company puts ESG as a priority, social, environmental, climate change, does the board have the right skills to lead the company in this area? Often they don't, and often that its understanding of these issues, it's not good enough, and then we challenge boards on their composition, on what are the gaps in skills. But also we pro boards, and we challenge them on how board members, they work together, how effective is the board, the decision-making process, the relationship between board and management. So we seek assurance, we seek evidence that the board is really fulfilling its duties, allocating its time correctly, not just on compliance or performance assessment, but crucially on strategy. Second is management and board succession. I think that's essential that the board looks into management succession, making sure that this is a smooth process that takes into account the evolution of the strategy, taking into account the culture of the company. The same with board succession, making sure that's the right mix of tenures, right mix of skills and ages and backgrounds, which is something it's particularly in emerging markets. I do a lot of my work in emerging markets. It's very hard to see board succession. It's not structured. It's all based on personal connections, and that leads to lack of diversity and which even to groupthink, which is something we must avoid at any cost. Is board with groupthink. Remuneration and incentives. That's we also spend a lot of time trying to understand how management, they are incentivized, and also how ESG factors are incorporated into the incentives of the remuneration. I think that's very important to build a culture where environmental and social aspects are part of the decision-making process, a part of capital allocation, and remuneration and incentives, they are key to that. So we seek this kind of integration between remuneration that takes into account not just share price or increase in earnings, but also rate of accidents or carbon emissions. So these kind of metrics we look for in remuneration schemes to help build a remuneration plan that it's fit for an ESG world, as our title of this session says. And then fourth, corporate culture. So we look for evidence on companies we look for a tone from the top, coming from the board, from management, where the company takes into account and gives proper consideration to all stakeholders, not just shareholders, but all stakeholders, and take into account ESG factors in all processes. It's not so it's in capital allocation, in remuneration, on succession, on career progression, on recruitment, when dealing with customers and suppliers. So that's this kind of culture that we look for. And in our engagements, it's not enough to hear from the chair of the CEO, we have the right culture in our company. We look for evidence of that. And this evidence goes beyond ticking all the boxes required by a corporate governance code or a legislation, but goes much deeper than that. And I think that's the challenge of the investor engagement. But it's essential working together, investor engagement, working together with legislation, corporate governance codes, to ensure that we don't have a corporate governance that is just for compliance sake, but it's so the company embraces the substance of good practice. So I'll hand back to Emma Jane, and I'm happy to answer questions at the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I recall it once been put to me that, when engaging with corporates, it was important, and I don't want to use the analogy of a combustion engine, but unfortunately that's where it is, that it was a little bit like checking a car, checking the wipers, checking the oil, checking the tires. But, to avoid box ticking, you really had to dive in and check the engine, how an entity was really working, or I suppose going forward, check the battery. But thank you for that sort of overview of how investors can engage more deeply with different corporates to understand what's truly going on under the hood to drive both the governance agenda, but of course we need the governance to be focused on environmental and social issues as well. So I might ask my panelists to join me on screen. If you're there, you are, which is great. And some of the questions are coming in from the audience, but we might just start firstly maybe with Peter. I have a question for you. You've outlined sort of on a macro level, there is increasing regulation addressing climate matters and sustainable investment. This has really moved from, as we said, like a voluntary type disclosure to one that is much more regulated. You touched on the SFDR and the EU taxonomy. These are some of the first key guide rails. So maybe just to touch on, what you're seeing on the ground. I suppose you've given us the regulatory overview, but what are you seeing on the ground as investors are trying to grapple and to integrate these first elements, I suppose, of regulations? What are the challenges you're seeing?
Many thanks, Emma Jane. Well, I think some of the challenges we've covered actually with an expert panel in Margaret and also with Jamie, and really it is actually striking the balance. So on one hand, you have this enormous body of work and the scale of the climate emergency. So I think the EU Commission has recently published figures after the Green Deal to say Europe needs an additional 350 billion in funding and investment per annum to drive this forward and meet our 2030 targets alone before we even look at net carbon zero in 2050. So the scale of the opportunity is enormous for some of the financial market participants in this area. And there's always the risk that we'll move too quickly, because I think the politicians and the regulators are walking a very fine tightrope, which I think they've just about got right, between pushing quite a significant volume of new rules and regulations into the system to ensure that there is urgency in this matter. They've clearly articulated they need private capital in the sector, but at the same stage trying to bring market participants with them to protect investors and I suppose this wider market from the number one risk, which is greenwashing. And I think that can be encapsulated when we see organisations move into this space, is striking that balance and ensuring, as today's topic has shown, that corporate governance is free. Corporate governance is truly set at the outside and is free to determine the strategy of an organisation. So what we mean by that is that all of these rules, if they're implemented in a way which is haphazard or not led from top down, they can result potentially in some of the very risks they're trying to guard against becoming of greater magnitude in your organisation. So the challenge we see, as we alluded to on some of the practical tips for boards, is really getting a very senior and engaged, and in some cases a very active board focused on these matters, understanding the challenges that are coming at them at quite a significant pace, and then implementing a very clear set of policies and procedures so that you can actually, one, come into compliance with these laws and regulations. And I like the point that Jamie mentioned, it can't be a box-ticking exercise. You really have to avoid presenteeism or branding in this one to really truly attract proper and continuing investment, but to ensure that that framework is there and that it's actively monitored. The other thing that we see increasingly is boards now moving ESG reviews and considerations as standing matters on their board. So in some regulated areas, the bank will, for example, ask, do you have a cybersecurity session at every single board meeting? I think it's time, if some organisations haven't already gone that far, is to ensure that at each and every monthly or quarterly meeting, there is a specific ESG or PRI agenda item.
Thanks, Peter. I think, just breaking it down, I suppose, to the specific items on the board agenda really is what it's all about, because that's how you're driving the different issues through the organisation. Just another question coming through for Margaret, and maybe this sort of follows on from some of Peter's points as well. You have lectured for years on executive remuneration. This is really a kind of a key corporate governance, I suppose, mechanism in terms of driving the E and the S agenda. The board has the power to set, the parameters around this for the executive. Jamie touched on it as well. How important do you believe this is as a sort of a key mechanism for change?
Okay. Gosh, how long have we got, Emma Jane? It would take I'll get on my soapbox now. I think one of the things about exec remuneration, it's always been used and espoused as a governance mechanism to align the interests of investors with executive directors. So giving the executive directors a little bit of skin in the game and incentivizing them to act in the interest of the investors. Interestingly, as we know, directors have one master, and that is the company itself. That's the legal reality, and we know that the practical reality is something very different. It's somewhat controversial, Emma Jane, in that one of my concerns, as you know from being in class with me, is that one of the things that the emergence of the long-term incentive plan and its evolution since the late 1990s, one of the kind of the downsides of that, among others, has been the creation of a significant gap between CEO salaries and executive director salaries and the average salaries within organisations. That doesn't speak in some way to the social dimension of ESG. I'm not quite sure what does. And I think that we, stand back, and I think investors need to stand back. I need to look at actually, is that something that we are that we want to encourage? The other probably somewhat controversial lens that I'd look at is whether, when it comes to things as fundamental as companies' environmental footprint and their societal footprint and the creation of a sustainable economy and a sustainable society, is that something that we need to incentivise? Is that something we should need to incentivise? And I think that that's a very open question and something that needs to be addressed. But I do think that in the world of long-term incentive plans or even short-term incentive plans, as they progress, I think that, we have seen the emergence over the last number of years. I mean, I'm teaching this subject
Right.
15
With
years.
you. Yeah. Yeah.
The emphasis on the non-financial aspects and the non-financial outcomes of arising from management actions, behaviours, and so on, grown significantly. So I think that's a hugely important aspect. And so if we have to have LTIPs and STIPs, I think they should be in. But I think that whether we need to incentivize them, I think that needs to be debated. And also, I think that whether, no matter what we do, again, going to not to labour the point, but actually, do we need to stand back? And if we really believe in actually the S dimension, particularly when we see how COVID has demonstrated the huge socioeconomic divide that exists globally, intercountry and globally. Is this something that we want to persist with? Do we still think that remuneration as a governance mechanism is correct? Because a lot of psychologists are saying that it's not, and even some diehard agency theorists that would have promoted it back in the 1990s have got back and said, we may have got that wrong. So maybe a slightly controversial lens to look at it, Emma Jane, but I think that these are issues that need to be debated and discussed.
Yeah. Thanks, Margaret. I only wish we had more time, because I know the issue of incentive versus reward and the importance of remuneration, the role of money talking to drive this agenda is one we could debate all afternoon. Maybe just moving on to Jamie. I know you mentioned the same issue, but in the context of your role, actually, it's worth noting, EOS Federated Hermes also work on behalf of the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund and other like-minded responsible investors who have been focused on many of these issues for quite a long time. They're only sort of gaining a lot of headlines now. Just in terms of, maybe you could comment on, how the expectations of clients have changed, over say the last 5 or 10 years, and in the context of the emphasis on governance and some of the topics that we've talked about today, and maybe also, to link it back to Peter's piece, the regulatory environment has obviously, is driving a lot of change, but do you think that's the only thing that's driving change at the moment?
Well, in terms of expectations or corporate governance, we see. I mean, depends on the market, but in general, I can say that we see more emphasis on gradually more emphasis on the substance over the form. So today is increasingly it's not enough, as I said, to tick all the boxes. Investors want to see more evidence that this is really leads to ticking all the boxes, is leading to better decision making, better risk management, and so that's I think the direction of travel. It's looking not just the form but also the substance, and so that's why we heading with our engagements, so putting more emphasis on that, and the integration of all the environmental and social factors into the corporate governance framework. It's they're not kind of standalone areas. So in some companies, we even see that. We see kind of there is an ESG department, or there is an ESG investor relations officer. And that's, for me, it's not a good sign. It's a sign that it's a silo. And we don't want that. We want to see truly an integration of ESG factors into risk management, into human capital management, and into capital allocation. That's what genuinely we want to see, and it's a corporate governance framework that's fit for purpose.
That's great. And actually, there's a question in from the audience. I think in some ways, I think you've probably touched on this already, Jamie, but if there's anything you want to add, or maybe Margaret, if there's anything you want to add, particularly for a bank or a financial institution, what do you think is the best practice for the corporate governance structure? Should it be sort of within the bank's own environmental social unit? Should it be embedded reporting for investment managers? Is it reporting into the risk management unit, or is it sort of the three lines of defence model? So I suppose it's a very particular question about the actual process of the substance. I don't know whether anybody has whether Jamie or Margaret, you might have a comment on that.
Well, I can, if I may comment on that, it's I've seen many banks that started in the beginning. They had a specialized environmental unit or environmental and social risk management unit was kind of a standalone. But more recently, this is migrating into the main risk management function. And I think that that's a good sign, because when it was standalone, there was completely, it was, if this is understood that environmental and social risk, they are material for the bank, which I believe they can be. So the consequence is that they should be part of the risk management framework. And I see many banks move in that direction, where others, I think the laggards, they still have, some of them, this standalone risk environmental function, isolated or as a silo.
I think with the way, just to add to that, Jamie, I agree with you. I think with the way, Emma Jane, that the strategy of banks is changing in response to the EU action plan and banks' role within that the EU action plan. I think that everyone's going to own a part of it. I think it's always good to have a cheerleader or a champion for a particular new area, but I think that it has to be socialised into across the three lines of defence, and that everyone owns a piece of it. But the board have to give very clear messages and create clear accountabilities within the organisation about their expectations. So I'd be inclined to say across the three lines of defence, I'd be inclined to say it's good to have a champion who keeps their eye on it, but no more than a head of compliance, I guess, would keep her eye on the compliance, his or her eye on the compliance culture, or a head of risk would make sure that risk is embedded on the first line. And in everything that we do, we have to mainstream sustainability risk into the day-to-day operations of the banks. That has to be done, and that I think is going to be across the three lines.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a multifaceted approach. I'm looking at the time here, and I know we need to start winding up. Peter, I might come to you for maybe a final comment. We're living in an age of really sort of an urgent transition, maybe a sustainability and a net zero even revolution, but as we're transitioning sort of into kind of our post-pandemic life, I think we're all probably starting to return to the office. I'm very jealous of you, Peter. You're in the studio today. I'm still at home. We'll be traveling again. You mentioned the word greenwashing. I heard a phrase today that I hadn't heard before, that ESG stands for everybody's still greenwashing. Are we in danger of returning to business as normal, or do you think, we're really on the cusp of change? To give you the final word.
I'm honoured to have the final word. Thank you very much, Emma Jane. I think those risks can be balanced. I think even looking at the evolution of a panel like this, I don't know if we'll ever go back. So particularly looking at some of our foreign participants, dialing in and able to communicate in a way. We always had video technology, but it was never used to this scale. And I think that only improves the quality of conferences and participants. It's difficult to fly around the world to go into these centres. I think also companies have realised, and corporates and financial entities, is that when COVID restricted travel to such an immediate extent, and also not just travel, but some other maybe polluting activities that they were engaged in, or for example, planning and development for huge scale office blocks, etc. The whole revolution in work from home and remote working will probably ease the strain on human resources and architecture. And I know, speaking from our own organisation, as I mentioned, we're in 16 financial centres globally. We did travel quite extensively to meet people. We used some of those business development techniques and also just meeting peers and regulators. And that probably will return to a level. I think there will be a balance. But I'm fairly confident that organisations have had a time to sit back. And actually, if I leave on kind of one note, it was probably all those pictures we saw globally during some elements of the greatest lockdowns, and it was a very difficult stories for the health services and our governments, etc. But if there was one area where there was a maybe a positive aspect to it was we saw how quickly certain areas of the planet recovered from very intensive economic activity. So I think we've seen that in real time. I think business practices have changed for good. And I think, again, drawing on our theme, I think the senior decision makers in firms, in banks, in asset managers have realized that, and their future working practices will probably be more sustainable and more aligned with the environment.
That's a hopeful and positive final comment from Peter there as we end our panel this afternoon. I hope we've successfully navigated you through the complexities of the regulation, through to the sort of I suppose the practical ways in which we can drive this agenda from the board level. I'd like to thank Peter, Margaret and Jamie again, and I hope you have enjoyed our panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.